"We need a mother," the cowboy's daughter said, and they reached for the Apache woman in chains. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The town of Birch Point sat quiet under the thinning late-afternoon light, its narrow street lined with weathered wooden fronts, hitching posts, and the uneven shadows of buildings that had been standing longer than most of the people inside them. A dry wind moved across the road, carrying dust that clung to boots, coats, and a few wagons still circling for trade before evening. The noise was low, made up mostly of subdued voices and the distant hammering from the blacksmith's yard. John Calder stepped out through the wide doorway of the blacksmith shop, adjusting his coat after a long conversation about tools needed for winter repairs. He carried himself with the quiet heaviness of a man who spent more time thinking than speaking. His hands bore rope burns and scars from years of ranch work, and his face showed the calm endurance that came from raising two children alone. His wife had died shortly after their younger daughter's birth, and every task since then had revolved around keeping the ranch stable and keeping his daughters safe from a world that did not always welcome them kindly. John set his hat lower on his brow and scanned the road, making sure the girls were where he had left them. He saw them standing near the watering trough across the street, their small figures pressed close together. Lila, the older one, held herself cautiously, her shoulders drawn tight whenever she was unsure of something. June, younger by 2 years, leaned forward with open curiosity, barely noticing the dust collecting on her boots. John crossed the street with steady strides, wondering what had captured their attention. Then he saw her. A trader's wagon was parked a few yards away, its back wheel braced by a loose stone. A woman stood chained to that wheel, her wrists locked in iron cuffs polished by rough use. She looked to be in her mid-20s, maybe a little older, and though her clothing was torn and the beadwork was damaged, the craftsmanship made clear she belonged to an Apache band from farther south. Her long black hair hung in tangled strands down her back. Dirt streaked her arms and face, but her posture remained upright, controlled, and guarded. She showed no visible injury apart from the raw skin around her wrists. John studied her for a long moment. Her breathing was uneven, not from panic, but from exhaustion. Her attention shifted slowly across the street until it settled on his daughters. She did not speak to them, nor did she turn away. She simply watched them with steady awareness, trying to understand what they wanted. John felt a flicker of tension rise in him. He had seen people treated poorly before, but seeing a woman bound in a town he brought his children to was something else entirely. He glanced at the trader leaning against the wagon sideboard. The man smelled strongly of cheap whiskey and wore a patched coat, stained from weeks on the road. He swayed slightly, greeting anyone who came near with a careless grin. The girls stepped closer. June tugged at John's sleeve without taking her eyes off the woman. "Pa," she whispered. "She looks hurt." Lila swallowed hard, her hands tightening together. "She's alone," she added quietly. John felt the weight of their words settle in his chest. His daughters rarely spoke openly about their wants. They had learned early that their father did what he could, and that he carried more responsibility than one person should. Hearing concern in their voices, real, immediate, told him exactly how deeply the sight had affected them. The trader noticed John approaching and straightened himself with clumsy enthusiasm. "Got a good deal today," he said, slurring slightly. "Pick her up near Dry Hollow. Tough one. Quiet too. Doesn't fight. Make you a fair price." John ignored the tone. He stepped closer to the woman, keeping his movements slow so she could see every intention. She didn't flinch when he checked the cuffs. The metal was tight against her skin, biting into bruises that had clearly formed over days, not hours. She watched his hands carefully, trying to understand what kind of man he was. John sensed no fear from her, only tension and a readiness to act if needed. He asked the trader in a low voice, "Why is she chained?" The man shrugged. "Easier to transport her. Folks pay more when they see they don't run." John felt a cold anger settle in his stomach, but he kept it hidden behind a controlled expression. He wasn't a man who solved problems with raised voices. He took out his money pouch and counted out the bills slowly, choosing not to negotiate. The trader blinked, surprised by the lack of resistance. But greed overtook confusion, and he accepted the money. Once the payment was done, John knelt to unlock the cuffs. The woman watched him carefully, waiting to judge whether this was another exchange of ownership or something else entirely. John worked the iron loose with steady fingers, avoiding any sudden movements. When the cuffs fell away, the woman exhaled sharply. Not relief, exactly, but the release of pressure she had been holding for too long. She flexed her fingers, testing her freedom, then raised her eyes to John. For the first time, he saw a mixture of caution and curiosity in her expression. She was trying to decide whether she could trust him enough to follow him out of town. John turned to his daughters. "Get the spare blanket from the saddlebag." They hurried to obey. The woman stood still, measuring every detail of the moment. The children's movements, John's tone, the road stretching out past the last of Birch Point's buildings. She seemed ready to run if she sensed deception, yet too weak to make it far. John guided her toward his horse. She followed without leaning on him, though it was clear she forced each step to remain controlled. Her body showed signs of dehydration and strain, but her discipline never broke. Once mounted, she sat behind him with her hands lightly gripping the saddle horn for balance. She didn't touch him otherwise. John respected that and kept his posture steady so she would not lose footing. The girls rode beside them on their small mare, glancing at the woman repeatedly, as if still unsure whether she was real or something the town would take back at any moment. As Birch Point faded behind them, the woman lifted her head, studying the open land ahead. She had no idea where they were going, yet she stayed on the horse without hesitation. John felt the familiar tension of responsibility returning. The same feeling he had carried since the day he became both father and mother to his girls. Bringing a stranger onto his land was a decision he would have avoided under ordinary circumstances. But today wasn't ordinary. Today he saw something in the woman's endurance that matched the quiet strength he tried to teach his daughters. His main mission had always been simple: protect his children, maintain the ranch, and keep his family together in a world that didn't make any of it easy. Now, unexpectedly, another responsibility rode behind him. And as the sun lowered behind the hills, John's instinct told him the decision he had made would change the shape of their lives in ways none of them could see yet. The trail to John Calder's ranch stretched across open land where dry grass moved in uneven patches and the last hints of sunlight slid across the earth in long, fading strips. The ride from Birch Point was slow, not because of distance, but because John wanted to avoid jostling the woman seated behind him. He could feel her maintaining careful balance, shifting her weight only when the horse changed pace. She hadn't spoken once, yet her awareness sharpened whenever they passed a bend or a break in the terrain. John glanced back only once, enough to confirm she was still steady. Her grip remained tight on the saddle horn, but her posture did not waver. She observed everything: the fences in the distance, the sloping ground, the small rise where the house stood waiting in the dimming light. Lila and June rode ahead of them now, eager to arrive before night settled fully. Their small mare trotted lightly, hooves breaking the quiet rhythm of the open land. The girls kept glancing over their shoulders, checking whether the woman followed willingly. John noticed their expressions brighten whenever she looked in their direction, even if she gave no visible reaction. By the time they reached the fence yard, the sun had dropped behind a ridge. The ranch stood calm, shaped by years of careful maintenance. A modest house with a deep porch faced the barn and corral. The lantern John left by the window each morning glowed faintly, guiding them the last few yards. John dismounted first, handing the reins to Lila. "Walk her to the post," he said. Lila nodded and led the mare away, while June hurried to open the gate. The woman remained still on the saddle, studying the layout of the property. Her breathing had grown more controlled since leaving town, but the stiffness in her shoulders revealed she was bracing herself for whatever came next. John approached slowly. "Take your time," he said, voice steady. She placed her hands on the saddle horn and lowered herself with careful precision. Landing on the ground with a slight wobble, she corrected quickly. John didn't reach for her arm. He wanted her to move without feeling crowded. She steadied herself, then stepped back to give space to the horse. June watched her with wide, unblinking eyes. "She's strong," she whispered to Lila. John heard it, though the woman showed no reaction. Her jaw tightened briefly, as if unsure whether to respond to the child's comment. Instead, she looked toward the house, trying to determine whether entering it would trap her or shelter her. John lifted the saddlebag. "Inside is warmer," he said quietly. She didn't move at first. She scanned the yard, the barn doors slightly ajar, the empty corral, the wood pile stacked unevenly against the side of the house. She was assessing escape routes, potential dangers, and the distance between herself and unfamiliar walls. Only after she calculated everything did she take a step toward the porch. The girls led the way with unspoken excitement, pushing the door open and rushing inside. When John gestured for her to enter, the woman stopped at the threshold. Her hand rested lightly on the doorframe. She was checking its sturdiness, testing whether she could pull it shut from the inside if she needed to. John respected the pause. His home had always been a place of safety for his daughters, but he understood it might look like a trap to someone who had spent months being moved like cargo. After several seconds, she stepped through the doorway. Inside, the house carried the warm scent of wood smoke and stew that had simmered earlier. The table stood near the window, set with bowls the girls had prepared before leaving for town. A coat rack held John's hat and an older jacket he kept for cold mornings. A kettle rested on the stove, still warm enough to steam lightly. The woman's eyes moved from one corner to another, taking in the details: stacked blankets, a shelf of tools, a small rocking chair that had belonged to John's late wife, the lamp resting beside a half-finished whittling project. Nothing about the space suggested danger, yet she remained tense, her muscles prepared for sudden movement. John set the saddlebag down on the table. "You can sit," he said. She did not approach the chair. Instead, she stood near the wall closest to the door, leaving herself room to move if needed. Her expression held no hostility, only uncertainty and fatigue. The girls climbed onto the bench and whispered to each other, unable to hide their excitement now that the woman was inside their home. Lila folded her hands in her lap, trying to appear composed. June leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, waiting for the woman to acknowledge her presence. John filled a tin cup with warm water and placed it on the table's edge. He didn't hand it directly to the woman. He left it close enough for her to reach, but far enough that she didn't feel pressured. She hesitated before stepping forward and taking it. She drank slowly, as if her throat had forgotten the feel of warm liquid. "Do you need more?" John asked. She shook her head. She spoke no words, yet her eyes flickered with something he recognized immediately: exhaustion mixed with suspicion, shaped by experiences she hadn't chosen. It wasn't fear. It was the controlled alertness of someone who had survived long enough to trust nothing at first glance. John motioned toward the hallway. "There's a small room at the back. It has a bed. You can use it." She turned her head slightly, evaluating whether the hallway would trap her. After a brief pause, she nodded once and followed him, keeping several steps of distance. He opened the door to a plain room, a narrow bed, a folded blanket, a small window facing the barn. She stepped inside but remained near the doorway, testing whether the floorboards creaked, whether any route existed besides the one she had entered through. John placed the lantern on the dresser. "You can leave the door open if you want," he said. "No one will bother you." She looked at him directly then, for the first time since they left town. Her dark eyes were steady, neither grateful nor dismissive. She was simply acknowledging that he had given her a choice. She left the door slightly open. John returned to the main room where the girls waited. June leaned into him, whispering, "Is she staying tonight?" "Just tonight," John said, though he wasn't certain if that was true. "She needs rest." Lila nodded thoughtfully, watching the hallway with a seriousness rare for her age. "She didn't look scared," she said. "Just tired." John agreed silently. He had seen fear often enough to recognize when it wasn't present. As he prepared the fire for the night, he heard the faint rustle of the woman settling onto the bed. No weight shifted in panic. No hurried breaths followed. She lay down carefully, as though unsure how long she would be allowed to remain still. The house grew quiet except for the crackling wood and the small sounds of the girls getting ready for sleep. John moved slowly through his nightly routine, conscious of a new presence down the hall. The decision he had made in Birch Point now rested within his walls, altering the rhythm of the home he had spent years keeping under control. He stood by the window for a long while, looking out across the darkness toward the distant lights of town. He wondered whether bringing her here had been impulsive or necessary. He thought about the girls' faces when they saw her in chains, about the way she held herself even when exhausted, and about the uneasy silence that now filled the house. His mission had always been survival, his daughters and the land that tied his family together. But tonight he felt that mission expanding, shifting, becoming something he hadn't expected. In the back room, the woman lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if she could trust the man who had freed her. But for the first time in months, she rested without iron on her wrists. And that was enough for her to close her eyes. A pale strip of early light pushed through the small gaps between the shutters, settling across the wooden floorboards outside the woman's room. The ranch was always quiet before dawn, but today the silence felt heavier, shaped by the presence of someone still adjusting to unfamiliar walls. John Calder rose from his bed before the sun cleared the ridge, slipping into his boots with movements practiced from years of routine. He paused outside the girls' room to hear their breathing, then made his way toward the main room. He noticed immediately that someone else was awake. The door to the spare room stood slightly open, exactly as it had been left the night before. Inside, the woman sat at the edge of the narrow bed, her posture rigid, her hair falling over her shoulders in a tangled curtain. She hadn't slept deeply. Her expression held traces of vigilance, the kind carried by someone who had spent too long in places where closing one's eyes without caution was dangerous. She stood when John appeared in the hallway. She didn't approach, but she didn't retreat either. Her attention shifted to the window behind him, confirming the time of day, then returned to him with a look that seemed to ask what he expected next. "You can come into the kitchen," John said quietly. "The stove's warm." She followed at a slow pace, her bare steps landing lightly on the floor, as if testing each board before committing her weight. The fire in the stove still smoldered from the previous night, sending thin waves of heat into the room. John added small pieces of wood, careful not to make sudden noise. The woman observed everything. How he moved, where he set his hands, which utensils he reached for first. Her expression didn't soften, but the sharpness held less edge than the night before. John set a pot of water on the stove. "I'll make coffee. Girls will wake soon." She nodded once, acknowledging his words, but offering nothing in return. The sound of footsteps soon echoed from the hallway. June entered first, rubbing her eyes and yawning loudly, unaware of how much sound filled the room. She blinked when she saw the woman standing near the table. "You're up early," June said, voice small but sincere. The woman didn't answer, but she gave a slight tilt of her head, an acknowledgement that June immediately accepted as permission to move closer. Lila followed, walking more carefully. She stopped beside her sister and studied the woman with a thoughtful expression. "You can sit if you want," she said softly, motioning toward a chair. The woman hesitated, then pulled the chair out and lowered herself into it, keeping her hands clasped lightly in her lap. It was the first time she had taken a seat without being prompted. John prepared simple breakfast, biscuits left from yesterday, and a small portion of preserved fruit. When he placed a plate in front of the woman, she waited a heartbeat before reaching for it, as though unsure whether she was allowed to take food freely. Once she began eating, her movement stayed slow, almost deliberate, but she didn't hide her hunger. The girls watched her with the same fascination as the day before, but now their expressions carried comfort rather than tension. June leaned forward. "Do you like it here?" she asked innocently. John opened his mouth to tell her not to pressure their guest, but the woman answered first with a quiet, firm nod. June beamed. After breakfast, John stood and reached for his coat. "I have chores outside." You're welcome to come or stay in here. Whatever you prefer. For a few seconds, she remained motionless, weighing her choice. Then she rose silently and followed him through the doorway, stopping only to take in the layout of the yard under daylight. The corral fence cast long, straight shadows across the ground, and the barn doors stood slightly open, letting out the faint smell of hay. John walked toward the barn with tools in hand. She kept a measured distance behind him. Her posture changed once they stepped inside. The horses shifted, and she reacted instantly, eyes narrowing as she studied them. She didn't move closer. Instead, she stood still and read their behavior like someone familiar with animals, but unsure how they would respond to her scent or presence. John noticed her assessing the mare in the first stall. "She's gentle," he said, nodding toward the horse. "Won't spook." The woman took a small step forward, extended her hand slowly, and waited until the mare leaned her head toward her. Only then did she lay her fingers gently along the horse's cheek. Her entire expression changed. Not relaxed, but more grounded, as if this was something she understood far better than the house she had slept in. "You've worked with horses before," John observed. She didn't speak, but her hand lingering on the mare's coat answered well enough. John returned to fixing the tack while she explored the barn with careful restraint. She inspected a bucket, glanced at the harnesses, and checked the floorboards for weak spots. She was learning the space as if preparing for trouble, not comfort. When John brushed out the second horse, he held out the spare brush. She accepted it without a word and began working on the mare from the opposite side of the stall. Her strokes were even, controlled, and respectful of the horse's reactions. John realized she was trying to contribute without overstepping, an instinct born from long months of captivity. The girls arrived ashore while later, running across the yard with excitement. June leaned her arms over the stall door. "She's brushing Pearl," she announced proudly, as though she had discovered something important. Lila stayed farther back, watching quietly. She seemed to understand the woman's caution more naturally than her younger sister. John continued his work without interrupting. The woman moved with a steady rhythm beside him, gradually settling into the barn's atmosphere. She didn't smile, but her body had stopped bracing with every new sound. By late morning, the chores were done, and the horses stood calm and groomed. John walked back toward the house with the girls trailing behind. When he turned to check whether the woman followed, he found her standing in the barn doorway, looking out across the land. Her eyes traced the hills, the fence line, the open stretch leading to the creek. She wasn't planning escape. She was studying the place that might become temporary shelter or was something else entirely. Her expression held no fear, only deep, private calculation. John waited without calling to her. After a slow breath, she stepped out into the yard and walked toward the house on her own. It was the first decision she made freely since she had arrived. The afternoon carried a steady chill as the sun crept behind a bank of thin clouds, dimming the ranch yard in a muted gray light. The wind had picked up since morning, brushing loose straw across the ground and tapping the porch boards with uneven rhythm. John returned from the far pasture carrying 2 coils of rope, his shoulders tight from hours of fencing work. He paused near the barn when he saw movement by the woodpile. The woman knelt beside a stack of unsplit logs, sorting them into neat rows, thicker pieces on one side, dry kindling on the other. She moved methodically, examining each log before placing it where it belonged. Her steps, her grip, even the angle of her posture told John she wasn't just trying to help. She was trying to understand the household's rhythm. Her face stayed neutral, but her eyes focused with quiet intention. He approached slowly. "You don't have to do that," he said, setting the rope down. She looked up just long enough to register his presence, then continued arranging the wood. She didn't dismiss his words. She simply chose to continue the task. Her breathing remained steady, showing she wasn't working from panic or desperation. She wanted structure, something predictable, something that didn't depend on anyone else's mercy. John didn't interfere. Inside the house, June's laughter echoed faintly through an open window, followed by Lila's softer voice urging her sister to keep things quiet. The woman's attention flicked toward the sound for only a moment. But in that brief motion, John caught a hint of guarded curiosity, as if she was slowly learning what it meant for a home to hold children's noise. She stood once the rows were complete. The wind tugged at her hair, revealing the side of her face still marked by recent hardship. John noticed the way she touched her wrist unconsciously, a gesture so quick most people would have missed it. He understood it for what it was, a reminder of skin that had only just been freed from iron. "Come inside when you're ready," he said. "Girls are making a mess of supper." The corner of her mouth twitched, not a smile, but the faintest response to the noise drifting from the kitchen. She wiped her palms on her torn deerskin skirt, brushed sawdust from her knees, and followed John toward the house with careful, balanced steps. Inside, the room was warm and cluttered. June stood on a stool near the stove, stirring a pot of beans with more enthusiasm than skill, sending small bits of sauce onto the stovetop. Lila sat at the table peeling potatoes with precise movements, her brow furrowed in concentration. They both froze when the woman entered. Lila glanced at John for approval. John nodded, and she returned to her work with renewed focus. The woman's eyes moved across the kitchen slowly, measuring each detail: the stove's heat, the knife's placement, the steam drifting from the pot. Her body tensed for a moment, sensing too much activity in a small space, but the sound of June's cheerful humming steadied her. John pulled out a chair. She hesitated, then sat, keeping her hands folded on the table. Lila placed a peeled potato near her and slid a spare knife across the wood surface. "If you want, you can help," Lila said. The woman lifted the knife, feeling its weight. She began peeling with calm, practiced movements, handling the task with a precision that surprised Lila. The girl watched for a moment, impressed by how quickly the peels fell in one continuous strip. While they worked, John prepared coffee. He set a tin cup in front of the woman without looking for her reaction. She sipped it cautiously, unused to the taste but appreciating the warmth. Her shoulders lowered a fraction after the second swallow, as if the heat from the drink reached something deeper than just her hands. June moved from the stove and set spoons on the table with clumsy excitement. "Pa, can she sit next to me tonight?" she asked loudly. John didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the woman first. Her expression held no objection. She simply continued peeling potatoes with the same even rhythm. John nodded. "If she wants to." At supper, the room changed in subtle ways. The woman sat between the girls, not at the far end of the table. She ate slowly, every movement careful but not tense. June spoke without fear, showing her a carved wooden rabbit she had made weeks earlier. The woman turned the small figure in her hand, examining the details with quiet interest before placing it back gently. Lila asked whether she wanted more food. The woman inclined her head in acceptance, but didn't reach until the plate was set closer. John watched all of it without intruding. He saw how the woman reacted to every gesture, not with gratitude or panic, but with calculation, as if cataloging what was expected here and what wasn't. Her guarded nature didn't fade, but it softened around the girls, who treated her presence as something important, not frightening. After the meal, John went outside to close the barn for the night. When he returned, the woman was washing dishes alongside Lila. She rinsed each plate carefully, ensuring no crumbs remained, stacking them with strict order. June sat by the fire brushing her doll's hair, glancing up every few moments to check whether the woman was still nearby. Every detail in the scene was new to the house. An extra pair of hands at the sink, another chair pulled close to the fire, the absence of tension that normally came after long silence. John leaned against the doorframe and watched them. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the familiar weight of trying to manage everything alone. When the woman finished drying the last plate, she placed it on the shelf and stood quietly by the wall, waiting to see what was expected next. John motioned toward the hallway. "You can rest if you want. Girls will be up a while." She nodded and walked toward her room with calm, deliberate steps. She didn't close the door completely, only enough to make the room feel like hers for the night. John returned to the main room, where the girls whispered excitedly by the fire, hiding their smiles behind their hands. They didn't speak of needing a mother this time. They didn't have to. The house had already begun shifting around the new presence, fitting itself to her cautious movements, her silent contributions, her steady hands. And John felt that shift more clearly than he wanted to admit. Late morning sunlight pressed across the ranch yard in a pale, even layer, bright enough to cut the chill, but not strong enough to warm the wind sweeping down from the ridge. John had been working since dawn, repairing a loose hinge on the barn's far door. The steady tap of his hammer echoed quietly across the land, disappearing into the open fields beyond the fence line. Inside the barn, the woman brushed down the gelding with slow, even strokes, her focus entirely on the horse's flank. The animal stood still under her attention, flicking its ears occasionally, but showing no discomfort. Her steady movements revealed familiarity. Her wrist turned gently at the end of each stroke, her stance shifting for balance in a way only someone accustomed to caring for livestock would know. She kept her breathing measured, exhaling softly whenever dust rose from the coat. The girls worked nearby, sweeping the stall with determined energy. June hummed a short tune as she worked, her broom scattering straw in crooked lines. Lila kept correcting her sister's pattern, growing more frustrated each time June undid her progress. Their quiet disagreement filled the space with a kind of normal noise the barn rarely held. John stepped back from the hinge, rolled his shoulders, and glanced across the open field. A faint tremor in the distance caught his attention. Not sound at first, but movement. Two riders approached from the ridge, their silhouettes small but unmistakable. They didn't follow the road. They cut straight across the grass, as though they had a purpose that didn't involve politeness or patience. John's jaw tightened. Visitors who ignored the road rarely brought good news. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his coat before taking a few steps toward the yard. The woman noticed a shift in his posture. She set the brush aside immediately and moved closer to the barn door, staying partly behind the frame while keeping her eyes on the riders. Her expression sharpened. Not panic, but controlled readiness, the kind that came from a life where danger often arrived without warning. The girls didn't notice right away. June continued sweeping until Lila grabbed her arm and pointed toward the open land. Both children froze, instinctively drawing nearer to the woman. John lifted one hand, signaling them to stay put. The two riders closed the distance quickly. Dust clung to their coats and hats, and their horses moved in a brisk trot that suggested impatience rather than urgency. When they reached the gate, one of the men reined in sharply, scanning the property with a narrowing gaze. John recognized them. Farmers from the north side of Birch Point, men who drank too much at the saloon and involved themselves in business that never concerned them. Neither had a reputation for kindness. "Calder," the taller one called out, sliding off his horse. "Heard you brought something home yesterday." John approached with controlled steps. "Something?" he asked, keeping his voice level. The man snorted. "That Apache woman from the trader. Word travels fast. Folks are talking." John stood still. He didn't raise his voice, didn't show irritation, but the tension in his shoulders made his stance unmistakable. "Not your concern." The second rider remained mounted, resting his hand on the saddle horn. "Town doesn't like surprises," he said. "Last thing we need is trouble because you decided to be generous." John's jaw tightened further. "She's resting. She isn't harming anyone." The taller man stepped closer, lowering his tone. "You don't know what she'll do. Her people." The sound of straw shifting interrupted him. The woman had stepped halfway into view, not hiding, but not fully exposed either. Her posture was steady. She placed herself slightly in front of the girls, shielding them without making it obvious. The men's eyes snapped toward her. Their expressions tightened, some mix of uncertainty, discomfort, and simmering prejudice. "She should go," the mounted rider muttered, "before someone gets nervous." John's voice dropped. "She stays." The taller man scoffed. "Pa thinks you've lost your mind. Says you're risking your daughters for someone you don't know." John didn't blink. "My daughters are safer here than talking to you." The comment halted the conversation. The mounted rider shifted uneasily in his saddle. The taller man took a slow breath, realizing the line he had crossed. We'll be back if town decides something needs doing, he said finally. You won't, John replied. The riders exchanged a look, uncertain whether pushing further was worth it. After a long pause, they turned their horses and rode off without another word, disappearing over the ridge in a trail of dust. The yard fell quiet. The woman remained still, her gaze fixed on the line of hills until the riders were fully gone. Her breathing, steady until now, deepened as tension eased from her spine. She watched John carefully, studying the way he lowered his shoulders only after danger had passed. John exhaled through his nose. He turned toward the barn. They won't come back, he said, though he knew she wouldn't take that as assurance. She didn't react to the statement, but her posture softened slightly. Lila stepped closer to her. Are you all right? She asked. The woman looked down at the girl with a quiet intensity. She nodded once, slow and deliberate. John motioned the girls inside. Wash up. Lunch is almost ready. They obeyed quickly, glancing back at the woman as they went. Once the children disappeared inside, John approached her. You didn't have to come out, he said. She lifted her chin slightly. It was the closest she had come to explaining herself. She would not hide from those who wished her harm, not on a day when suspicious eyes were watching and not in front of the children. John understood the meaning behind the gesture. He also understood something else. Her presence changed the ranch. Not because she demanded space, but because the world outside responded to her existence with suspicion and impatience. He would now have to face that reaction every time he went into town, every time a rider passed the fence line, every time someone decided to interfere. But as he watched her return to the gelding and resume brushing the coat with calm, deliberate strokes, he realized the decision he made in Birch Point had not been impulsive at all. It had been necessary. The barn settled back into its afternoon rhythm, but the air carried a new undercurrent, one of quiet determination, shared between two people who said nothing yet understood the same truth. Their lives had already begun to shift in ways that could not be undone. The first signs of night settled early, bringing a steady drop in temperature that crept across the ranch yard long before the sun had fully disappeared. A sharp wind rolled down from the high ridge, bending the tops of the sparse grass and threading through the gaps in the fence rails. The house windows rattled softly as gusts pushed against the wooden walls, warning of a long, restless evening. John finished tying down the last section of tarp covering a stack of feed sacks. He paused to inspect the sky. The clouds hung low, heavy enough to promise colder weather by dawn. He rubbed his hands together, feeling the dryness in the air, then headed for the porch. His boots struck the steps in slow, measured thuds. Inside the house, the fire glowed low in the stove, casting a warm, steady light across the room. The smell of leftover beans lingered faintly, mixing with the scent of burning wood. Lila and June sat cross-legged on the rug, arranging a small pile of carved wooden animals into rows. Their whispered conversation faded when John stepped inside. The woman sat near the far corner, knees drawn close, her back resting lightly against the wall. She had pulled the blanket from her room around her shoulders. The fabric didn't hide how alert she remained. Her posture revealed a constant readiness, as if a single unexpected sound might call her to her feet. She watched the girls quietly, her expression thoughtful rather than tense. John removed his coat and hung it on the rack. The woman's eyes flicked toward the door behind him, a reflex she had not yet shed. He spoke softly, not wanting to startle her. Wind's rising. Might get rough tonight. She gave a single nod, the blanket shifting as she adjusted her grip. The edges of her hair moved slightly each time a draft passed through the room. The girls shuffled their carvings aside and crawled toward the stove. June tugged open the iron door, letting more light spill out. It's colder than yesterday, she said, stretching her hands closer to the heat. Lila nodded. Can we sit by the fire for a while? John nodded, stoking the flames with careful strokes. The fire crackled louder, announcing a new wave of warmth drifting into the room. The woman shifted her seat a few inches closer, staying near the wall but allowing the heat to reach her. Silence settled again, comfortable for the girls, uncertain for her. John sat opposite her, legs stretched toward the stove. He avoided staring directly. knowing she preferred not to feel scrutinized. Still, he observed quietly the way her fingers tightened around the blanket when the wind rattled the shutters, the slight tremor in her breathing when the house groaned under a strong gust, the effort she made to remain composed in a space she still didn't trust fully. A sudden clang echoed from outside, a loose gate striking its post. June flinched, dropping her wooden rabbit. The woman rose instantly, placing one hand on the table for balance. Her reaction was fast, almost instinctive, revealing how deeply vigilance had carved itself into her reflexes. John stood as well. "Just the wind," he said calmly. "The south gate needs fixing." Her shoulders lowered gradually, but she didn't sit again until the next gust proved uneventful. She took her seat slowly, this time closer to the stove than before. Lila reached for another log. "Can I add it?" "Go ahead," John said. When the flames rose, the woman's face became clearer, and John saw exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes. Exhaustion not from labor, but from staying alert for months without anyone she trusted nearby. He wondered how long she had been moving before the trader caught her, and how she had survived without collapsing under the strain. The girls returned to their blanket pile of carvings. June looked toward the woman. "Do you want one?" she asked. The woman hesitated. Her gaze drifted to John, as if checking whether accepting the offer would violate some unspoken boundary. His expression remained neutral. She reached out slowly and touched the little wooden horse June had set beside her. She didn't take it immediately. She studied it first, the carved mane, the uneven legs, the way one ear tilted slightly. Then she closed her hand around it. June grinned and returned to sorting the others. Lila didn't comment, but she watched the woman with a subtle softness that hadn't been there a few days earlier. John settled into his chair, folding his hands loosely. "You can stay by the fire as long as you want," he said quietly. "Storms make the house noisy." She didn't answer, but her posture loosened another fraction. Her breathing slowed. The lines of tension in her arms eased. She allowed the blanket to slip lower on her shoulders, letting the heat warm her properly. A few minutes later, she glanced toward the window. The wind battered the house again. She didn't flinch this time. John knew what he saw: a woman adjusting, not surrendering. A woman learning the difference between danger and noise. A woman testing whether a roof could protect her after too many nights exposed to cold, hunger, and other people's cruelty. As the fire settled into a steady rhythm, the girls curled together on the rug, eyelids drooping. June whispered something to Lila and pointed subtly toward the woman. Whatever she said made her sister nod and smile faintly. The woman noticed, but didn't question it. When John finally rose to carry the sleeping girls to their bed, the woman stood as well, unsure whether she should follow or remain. John looked at her gently. "Stay here. Fire's warm. I'll be back." She hesitated only a moment before sitting again. By the time John returned, the room felt different, not louder or brighter, but more inhabited. She sat quietly, legs folded beneath her, holding the little wooden horse in her lap, as though deciding what it meant to her. Her expression had lost its defensive sharpness. Something calmer had taken its place, not trust, but consideration. The wind continued pressing against the house. For the first time since she arrived, she didn't look toward the door every time it creaked. A thin crust of frost coated the ground when John stepped outside at first light. It was earlier than any frost should have appeared, the season not yet deep enough for winter's full bite. He crouched near the trough, scraping away the ice with the back of his glove. The air felt sharp in his lungs, and his breath showed in small, faint clouds. He knew instantly that whatever weather pattern was shifting upstream wasn't done tightening its grip. Inside the barn, the horses stamped their hooves, restless from the sudden cold. John moved quickly to check the stalls, laying extra hay and tightening blankets. As he worked, he kept glancing toward the house, aware that the freezing air might unsettle the woman more than she would show. By the time he returned to the porch, the door cracked open. The woman stepped out slowly, wrapped in the blanket from her room. She exhaled steadily into the morning air, watching the frost glow beneath the pale sun. The cold didn't scare her, but made her alert in a different way. Her gaze traveled across the land, as if determining how fast the weather could turn dangerous. John stood at the bottom of the steps, brushing dirt from his sleeves. "Cold came quick," he said quietly. She looked down at him and nodded once. Her attention drifted toward the barn, taking in the horses' movements and the thin plume of steam rising from their nostrils. John could see she was assessing whether the animals needed additional care or if the cold was manageable. The girls appeared behind her moments later, both bundled in mismatched scarves and jackets that had seen too many seasons. June tugged on her sister's sleeve. "It's freezing," she complained, rubbing her hands together. Lila folded her arms. "It'll get worse." The woman shifted the blanket around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. She didn't speak, but she gestured toward the barn, indicating they should move before the weather turned harsher. John recognized the intention immediately. She wanted to help secure the animals before the frost deepened. The four of them walked together across the yard. Their breath trailed in front of them in uneven puffs. The frost crunched softly beneath their boots, leaving marks that lingered longer than normal. Inside the barn, the smell of hay and warm animal breath softened the bite of the cold. The woman moved ahead, checking the latch on each stall and the horses' blankets, her hand steady even as her fingers reddened from the air. She paused at the gelding, placing her palm against his neck to feel his temperature. Satisfied, she stepped aside to allow June to offer him a handful of grain. John climbed the ladder to the loft to retrieve extra bedding. When he looked down, he saw the woman guiding Lila in folding a new blanket. She didn't use words. She simply showed her how to pinch the corners and roll the layers so the weight distributed evenly. Lila followed each motion carefully. For the first time, they worked together without hesitation. By mid-morning, the barn felt secure, but the cold refused to ease. Frost clung to the fence rails like thin, crystalline dust, and the sky took on a muted gray tone that made the land look subdued and distant. John returned to the house with the girls sprinting ahead. When he held the door open, the woman stepped inside last, as though waiting to ensure no one needed help before she crossed the threshold. Her blanket slipped slightly, revealing the worn stitching at the edge of her clothing. She adjusted it quickly, not out of vanity, but habit. She protected what little she had left. Once inside, she walked to the stove and held her hands close to the heat. The girls followed, sitting on the floor near her feet. The warmth drew a slight shift in her expression, almost relief, but quieter, as if she wasn't used to admitting when she felt comfort. John placed a pot on the stove, filling the room with the slow, bubbling sound of heating water. "Storm's moving in tonight," he said, keeping his tone steady. "We'll need to stay close." She listened without looking away from the fire. Her shoulders rose and fell in a controlled breath. She understood what storms meant on open land: noise, darkness, unpredictability. None of it frightened her, but all of it demanded readiness. Lila broke the silence. "Do storms bother you?" The woman lowered her gaze toward the girl. For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she shook her head gently. It wasn't a denial. It was an acknowledgement that storms were simply part of life, not something to fear. John watched the exchange carefully. Her answers were still guarded, but they were becoming responsive rather than defensive. That difference, however small, mattered. Later, when the water boiled and the room warmed, John set out bowls for midday meal. The woman helped without instruction, adjusting the placement to make room for the girls and retrieving a spare cup for John. Her movements were precise, showing she was learning the house's layout and rhythm. While they ate, the wind outside rose in slow, steady surges. The shutters trembled slightly. The girls ate faster than usual, glancing at the window every few minutes. John kept his voice calm to steady them, asking about chores and small tasks. The woman ate quietly but observed everything. Her attention seemed to settle on the sounds approaching from outside, the way the wind scraped against the siding, the soft rumble of clouds moving overhead. It wasn't fear. It was assessment. She had lived through nights when storms meant danger from people, not weather. After the meal, she stood and moved to the window. Her fingers hovered above the glass, sensing the vibration of the wind. She turned to John and gestured toward the yard, indicating the possibility of loose items around the porch. He grabbed his coat. "I'll check." She stepped forward before he could leave, shaking her head slightly. She wanted to help. John hesitated, but then nodded. "All right, but stay close." They walked outside together, the cold more biting now that the sun had weakened. She moved with controlled strides, scanning the porch for anything that could break loose. They secured tools, tightened rope bundles, and pushed a wooden crate against the side of the house to prevent rattling. The wind cut across the yard in sharp bursts, pushing against their clothes and stinging their skin. When they finished, John stood with his hands on his hips, exhaling a long, steady breath. She observed the horizon, reading the signs in the shifting clouds. "Thank you," he said quietly. She didn't look at him, but her shoulders eased in a way he hadn't seen before. They returned inside, just as the first flakes began to drift down. Thin, scattered, harmless for the moment, but signaling a night that would demand closeness, warmth, and trust. As the doors shut behind them, the ranch took on a different feel. The cold was no longer just weather. It was something that pushed them together, something that narrowed the world to the small, warm space inside the house. And for the first time since she arrived, the woman didn't linger near an exit. She sat near the fire instead, allowing the warmth, not fear, to guide her actions. Snow continued to fall through the night and well into the morning, covering the ranch yard in a thin white sheet that muffled sound and slowed movement. The air held a faint stillness, the kind that came after a long storm when everything settled, but nothing yet warmed. John stepped outside with a shovel, clearing narrow paths between the porch, barn, and trough. His breath rose in steady puffs, and the cold clung to his mustache and beard. The woman watched from the doorway for a moment before stepping out, her blanket replaced by John's spare coat. It was too big on her, hanging past her elbows, but she didn't seem bothered by the size, only by the cold biting at her cheeks. She crossed the yard with small, steady steps, careful not to slip on the hard-packed snow beneath the top layer. John paused when she approached. "Ground's slick," he said. She crouched beside the trough to test the ice for herself, pressing her palm lightly against it. She didn't speak, but the tension in her jaw told John she knew how quickly freezing water could threaten animals. Without waiting for instruction, she retrieved a wooden mallet from the barn wall and chipped a clean opening so the horses could drink. John watched her work with quiet respect. Her movements were efficient, completely focused, guided by survival logic rather than habit. She carried herself like someone who had lived through far harsher conditions than this ranch could offer. The girls came outside next, bundled tightly in scarves that covered half their faces. June struggled to walk in the thick fabric, kicking snow as she moved. Lila trailed behind, more cautious, watching the woman rather than the ground. "Pa," June said, pointing at the trough. She knew what to do before you said anything. John nodded. She's seen colder places. The woman lifted her eyes, acknowledging the compliment without expression. She placed the mallet back where she found it, brushing snow from her hands. Inside, once the chores were done, the stove filled the house with deep warmth. The room brightened as the fire grew, casting golden light across the table and the girls' wool blankets. The woman stood near the stove, letting heat soak into her hands. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, though her gaze kept sweeping the room as if choosing where she felt safest. John began mending a broken latch at the table. He didn't look directly at her when he asked, "You sleep all right?" She paused, unsure whether the question demanded a long answer. After a moment, she nodded once. The truth was more complicated. She had slept lightly, listening to every creak of the house, every gust of wind, but she had also slept without chains, without hostile voices, without the fear of hands gripping her wrists in the dark. That was enough for now. The girls joined her near the stove. June handed her a bundle of colored thread, tangled from playing. "We can't fix it," she said, frustrated. The woman took the bundle gently, rolling it between her fingers. She sat down and began separating each thread with slow, practiced movements. Her hands worked with calm precision, coaxing the knots loose one by one. June watched in awe, whispering excitement to her sister. Lila leaned closer, studying the technique silently. John noticed something he hadn't seen before. The woman wasn't just completing a task. She was teaching through action, letting the girls observe without calling attention to it. When she finished, she placed the thread in June's open palms. June grinned so widely her cheeks reddened. Lila stepped forward with hesitation. I wanted to ask something, she said, her voice quiet but steady. John lifted his eyes from his work. He didn't interfere. The woman turned to Lila with full attention, giving her space to speak. We don't know what to call you, Lila said. Her brows pinched with worry, as if afraid she had overstepped. We don't know your name. The room fell still for a moment. The woman's gaze shifted downward. Not from shame. She was deciding whether she could trust them with something personal. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her borrowed coat. She didn't move, didn't frown, but the internal conflict was clear. Names carried weight. A name meant identity. A name meant belonging to something or someone. She had not spoken hers since the day she was taken. John waited without pressure, ready to accept silence if that was all she could offer. Finally, she inhaled through her nose and spoke softly. One word, shaped carefully, carrying the quiet strength she guarded so fiercely. Her voice was rough at the edges from disuse, but steady. My name is Ahani. Lila repeated it gently, tasting the shape of it. Ahani, June whispered. Ahani, almost like she had discovered something precious. John set his tools down. He studied her with renewed understanding. Ahani's eyes met his for a brief moment, and in that exchange he saw something new, an unspoken decision. She wasn't hiding now. She wasn't protecting a secret. She was acknowledging the house, the girls, and John himself as people who could be trusted with something she had kept buried. Ahani looked away quickly, almost embarrassed by the vulnerability of speaking. John cleared his throat softly. It suits you, he said. She blinked once, absorbing the comment without dismissing it. The girls drifted back to their spot by the fire, whispering her name as if memorizing it. Ahani watched them for a long while, her expression unreadable but not cold. As the day stretched into evening, the wind eased, leaving the house wrapped in quiet. Ahani helped with supper without being asked, chopping vegetables with a steady grip, moving around the kitchen as though she already knew where every tool belonged. She didn't speak again, but she didn't retreat either. She remained in the center of the house's warmth, close to the stove, close to the girls, close to John's steady presence. When night came, she didn't pause at the doorway of her small room as she usually did. She walked in with certainty, closing the door only enough to mute the noise. John watched from the hallway, knowing something important had shifted. Ahani had not just given them her name. She had taken her first step toward belonging somewhere again. The snow began to thin by late afternoon, leaving patches of bare earth showing through the white layer. The air stayed cold, but the sharp bite from the previous days had softened, replaced by a quiet stillness that settled across the property. John stepped outside to check the fence line, pulling his coat tight as he scanned the ground for signs of wear from the storm. The rails held strong. Nothing had shifted. From the porch, Ahani watched him work. She stood with one hand resting lightly on the railing, her hair pulled back with a strip of thread the girls had given her. She had slept for the first time without waking at every sound, though she hadn't mentioned it. John had seen it in her eyes when she emerged from her room earlier. Less strain, fewer shadows. Inside, the girls argued over which carved animals belonged where. Their voices drifted through the open doorway. Ahani listened with a faint tilt of her head, adjusting her position when the wind pushed against her legs. She wasn't guarding the house. She wasn't afraid. She was simply present. John walked back from the fence with steady strides. When he reached the porch, he brushed the snow from his sleeves. Fence is good, he said. Ahani nodded, her gaze fixed on the open land for a moment before she turned back toward the door. The storm had shifted something inside her, something subtle but permanent. She no longer eyed the horizon as if it might swallow her. She no longer kept her body angled toward an exit. She stood centered, grounded, not ready to run. As they stepped into the house together, June rushed forward holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "We made this," she announced with pride. Lila stayed close behind, smiling shyly. Ahani knelt slowly. "For me?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. The girls nodded eagerly. Inside the bundle lay a thin leather cord with 2 wooden beads, one carved by June, uneven but bright, the other carved by Lila, smooth and carefully shaped. Ahani's fingers brushed over the beads with gentle attention. Her eyes softened, the way someone reacts when given something without expectation, without demand. "It's so you stay here," June said simply. Lila elbowed her sister. "We meant, so you know you belong." Ahani's breath caught just slightly. She looked up at John, unsure how to respond. Her jaw tightened, not in resistance, but in the quiet effort it took to hold emotion steady. John spoke quietly. "They mean it." The room fell still except for the crackling stove. Ahani rose, the cord held carefully in her hand. She walked to the table, set the bundle down, and turned to face John directly. For the first time since she arrived, she held his eyes without looking away. "You took me from chains," she said, voice level yet carrying a depth she rarely revealed. "But you didn't treat me like someone who owed you anything." She paused, steadying her breath. "Your girls, they made me remember how to live around people again." John felt tension in his chest. Not discomfort, but the weight of something long overdue. Ahani continued, her tone firm and clear. "I want to remain here, if you wish the same." The girls froze in anticipation. John didn't hesitate. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because of what happened in town. Not because the girls asked. Because you've made this house feel alive again." Ahani lowered her gaze briefly, absorbing his words with seriousness. When she lifted her head, a calm strength settled across her features. "I will stay," she said. June burst forward and hugged her around the waist before anyone could stop her. Ahani stiffened, startled by the sudden contact, but she placed her hand gently on June's back, accepting the gesture. Lila joined, more carefully, resting her cheek against Ahani's arm. John stepped back, watching the scene with a slow exhale. The house, once stretched thin and quiet, now held warmth beyond the fire's reach. That evening, the 4 of them sat together at the table for supper. The girls talked about spring chores and the animals they wanted to raise. Ahani listened, offering short answers when asked, but no longer shrinking from conversation. John observed her as she moved through the kitchen, how she placed dishes without hesitation, how she adjusted the lamp's wick, how she took her place at the table as though she had done it for years. After the meal, Ahani reached for the leather cord with the wooden beads. She tied it around her wrist, pulling the knot tight enough to hold, but loose enough not to restrict. She glanced at John with a quiet certainty. He understood. It wasn't just a trinket from girls. It was her choice made visible. Her acceptance of a place that had once been foreign, her decision to begin again in a home where nothing was demanded of her but presence. Night settled slowly, bringing a calm, steady darkness that no longer felt threatening. The wind faded. The house grew quiet, but not empty. The girls fell asleep curled together under thick blankets. John checked the windows, then paused near Ahani's doorway. She stood inside her room, arranging the few belongings she had into a small pile. When she noticed him, she turned. "Good night," she said, her tone soft but confident. John nodded. "Good night, Ahani." She closed her door gently, not to shut them out, but because the room was hers now. And the ranch, once shadowed by silence and loss, held a new shape, a family built not through blood, but through decisions made in quiet moments. Ahani stayed. John stayed. The girl stayed. What began in chains ended in peace, in belonging, and in the steady warmth of a home finally complete. The end.